Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that is focusing on something that a lot of us, especially in the survivor community, caregiver community, and of course, healthcare professional community, really care about, which is survivorship and late effects. And we're going to hear about premature aging and accelerated aging and things like that. And I'm really honored that ACCESS and Dr. Annalyn Williams have come together to make this session happen during their summer and to bring it to you all. I had the pleasure of seeing this talk by Dr. Williams last summer, and it was like a lot of really new information for me that felt like a missing puzzle piece to my decades of questions and issues that had come up and health issues and feeling sort of very invalidated by the system. And so even though it was heavy information, it was almost like the last piece I needed to explain what my experience has been like. And it really resonated with me in the room. And I'm so glad that Dr. Williams has agreed to share again today. And so thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. Thanks, Steph.
Thank you, Venetia. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, ACCESS, as hopefully many of you know, is a pan-Canadian pediatric cancer network, and all of us together, including putting together these webinars, work and coordinate and collaborate clear across the country. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the relationships of the First Nations and UNMHT across Canada that allow us to do all of this wonderful work that we do, but also that allow us to incorporate all of the different points of views and knowledge from across the pediatric cancer journey, no matter where we live across the country or what our ancestry or background has been. Next slide, please. So today we are going to have the webinar that is being put on, and as if you have questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom or somewhere on everyone's screen. If you have a question, please feel free to put the question in the Q&A. If you're comfortable, please also type your name and where you're from. If you wish to remain anonymous, please feel free to do so. And the questions will be stewarded at the end of the talk, and we will try to get through as many as possible. If there are questions that are not able to be addressed, we will try to make sure that they are afterwards and be able to share them as a resource. So your next slide, please. Today, as Venetia says, we are very excited to be joined by Dr. Annalyn Williams, who will be presenting her presentation about work that is called Ahead of Their Time, Premature and Accelerated Aging Amongst Survivors of Childhood Cancer. I'm very excited to hear this webinar presentation. Dr. Annalyn Williams is an assistant professor in the Department of Surgery in the Division of Supportive Care and Cancer at the University of Rochester Medical Center. And she has much experience in this field of research. And I'm very excited to continue to hear more about it in the next hour. So, Annalyn, if you could please take it from here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie and Venetia. It's truly my honor to be with you all this afternoon and present some of the things we've been working on. I grew up near Niagara Falls, New York, so right across the border, and have tons of family in Canada. So I always love an opportunity to cross the border and share what we're doing internationally. So and this venue in particular is special. So thank you very much for inviting me. I don't have any financial disclosures or conflicts of interest, but I do want to start this talk with a little bit of a disclaimer. The data I'm going to present today, as Venetia alluded to, might be hard to hear or see. And I just want to acknowledge that I am also a survivor myself. I had an acute leukemia, and I've been to talks like this before where it can be rather difficult to see some of these plots and figures and wonder where I lie in all of that. So I want to just take a moment and say that you're not alone. And I'm so happy to hear that there's going to be a debriefing session after this. I think that is so important because, for many of you, this will elicit some varying range of emotions. But I also want to take a moment and tell you that the data I'm going to present today are group averages. So this represents what we know so far to be the average experience. They in no way represent any one individual's experience or any one individual's future. So please keep that in mind as we go through the data. And I'm always happy to connect with folks, both through the Q&A, but as well as after the talk. If you have questions or you want to process any of this together, I'm more than happy to do that. So with that, we'll get into the data. So as many of you know, we've made dramatic and very impressive gains in the treatment for pediatric cancers in both the US and Canada over the past several decades, going from as low as 20% in the 1950s to over 85% today. And for some tumor types, that's over 95%. And that has resulted in over 50,000 Canadians and over 500,000 Americans alive today who were previously diagnosed with a childhood cancer. However, these survivors are at risk for premature mortality, meaning mortality earlier than we would anticipate. So this is an analysis we did using SEER, which is our cancer surveillance system in the US. We looked at anyone diagnosed under the age of 20 between 1975 and 2016 and calculated something we call excess deaths. This is essentially the observed number of deaths among those with cancer minus the number of deaths that we would expect to see. So this is deaths above and beyond what you might expect in a similar age, sex, and race matched population. And when we look at the number of excess deaths occurring in the first 5 years, from 1985 to 2015 in this figure, you see what you would expect to see, this nice decline in the number of excess deaths, which correlates well with the improvements in 5-year overall survival I just showed you. But when we add in deaths occurring between 5 and 10 years in green, or 10 or more years from diagnosis in red, we can see that the total number of excess deaths really hasn't changed much over time, meaning that deaths occurring 10 or more years from diagnosis are actually negating the improvements we've seen in 5-year overall survival. And this is because these survivors, as you're all well aware, are treated during a developmentally vulnerable time, and the treatments we give them predispose them for a host of chronic health conditions. This graph is showing you the cumulative burden of grade 3 or higher chronic health conditions. And you can think of this as a cumulative incidence curve, where it's counting both the number of people with a condition, but also the number of conditions that person has. So the survivors are in red or blue, and non-cancer controls are in black. And you can see that at any age, the survivors have, on average, more grade 3 or higher chronic health conditions than the controls. And these are conditions that require routine medical management or even may be severe or life-threatening. And I think what's even more upsetting about these data is that by age 50, almost all of the survivors in this data set had at least one of those conditions. So this population really has a significant risk of multimorbidity. And more importantly, this multimorbidity is occurring decades earlier than their peers. And it was really data like these that have triggered many researchers like myself to start thinking about this concept of premature or accelerated aging. So what exactly do we mean by that? I think we all know that there's large variability in aging, right? You have people in your life, or you encounter people who, look like they've aged really well, and you would never guess that they're in their 70s. And you have other people in your life who, very, very obviously look like they are in their 80s or 90s. So there's this idea that chronological age is declining at the same rate for everyone, but the pace of your biologic or physiologic aging differs greatly among individuals. So we all have some level of physiologic and cognitive reserve that declines naturally with age, which is demonstrated by this dark blue line. And when someone's diagnosed and treated for cancer, we hypothesize that we actually shift their aging trajectory, and that this might set them on what we call an accelerated aging trajectory, where the rate of decline is increased relative to their peers, and they reach thresholds for aging-related conditions like cognitive and functional impairments or even death sooner than their peers. Or perhaps we've shifted their trajectory and they continue to decline at the same rate they would have, but because we shifted that trajectory down, they still reach those thresholds sooner than their peers. And we call this premature aging. And it's important to understand these trajectories in the context of survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer because they have so many decades of life left to live. We need to know who is at risk for a premature onset of aging-related conditions like dementia so that we can intervene and mitigate that risk. So how can we measure aging? Well, there are many, many different ways, and I'm only going to touch on a few today, but I'm going to lump them into three major domains. The first being biologic aging. There's extensive research on the biology of aging, so what's happening at a molecular and cellular level. And there's actually been 10 different hallmarks of aging that have been proposed. And the first of which we'll focus on mostly today is epigenetic modifications. But other hallmarks include telomere shortening, inflammation, and others. Next, we have the idea of physiologic aging. So the phenotype of aging, what you actually see. So it's not hard to imagine that if there's all these molecular changes, that those would eventually manifest as physiologic or organ level deficits. And this can also be measured several ways. The first two I've listed here are from a frailty framework and include Fried's frailty phenotype and the deficit accumulation index. And we're going to talk about both of those today, but we can also look at the burden of chronic health conditions like I was showing you earlier. And then lastly is cognitive aging, which is a big concern for most people and can be measured using either objective neuropsychological batteries or various self-report measures, and both are equally important. And these tests often cover a variety of different cognitive function domains, but the most common that we talk about with aging are memory and attention, because those are commonly impaired in Alzheimer's and related dementias. So before we get into each of these, most of the data I'm going to show you today is from something called the St. Jude Lifetime Cohort. So I want to take a minute to introduce that cohort and where these data are coming from. So you may be familiar with St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which is here in the US in Tennessee. They have the St. Jude Life Cohort, which is a cohort of over 5,000 survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer who were treated at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital and were at least 5 years from their diagnosis when they joined the cohort. And this cohort was designed to retrospectively get comprehensive treatment data and prospectively follow survivors for various outcomes. And it's truly amazing. The participants come back to St. Jude and they spend about 3 days there undergoing a comprehensive assessment. Includes a full physical and history, every test you can imagine, EKGs, pulmonary function tests. They do a cognitive and functional assessment. So it really has incredibly robust, clinically and objectively assessed data. So let's start with biologic aging and more specifically epigenetic modifications. So as an extraordinarily brief introduction to epigenetics, something called DNA methylation is the addition of a methyl group to your DNA where a cytosine is attached to a guanine or a CPG site. So if you think about a computer as an analogy, you can think of your DNA as the hardware and the DNA methylation as the software. It acts as a coding system to tell your body which genes to code for without actually changing your genotype. So if the promoter region of a gene is hypermethylated, typically that gene would be silenced and that protein would not be made. Now, very importantly, these changes are heritable. So their DNA methylation patterns can be changed. So many researchers have become interested in this to understand how gene expression happens and how we might actually intervene on it. So at the time of the data I'm going to show you today, we had DNA methylation measured on just about 2,100 survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer and 282 controls who had never had cancer in St. Jude Life. Now, to do these types of assays, we extract DNA from something called peripheral blood mononuclear cells, but you can also get DNA from whole blood. And these particular data were generated from the Illumina EPIC 850K array, or the version 1 chip for those of you familiar. But essentially this means that we can measure DNA methylation at over 850,000 CPG sites. And essentially what that's doing is giving us an average methylation value for each one of those CPG sites, where 0 means it's completely never methylated, and 1 meaning the site is completely methylated on average. But obviously these values lie somewhere in between. We can then take the CPG level data and predict something we call epigenetic age or biological age using an epigenetic clock. And essentially these clocks are huge multivariable models of those methylation weights at the CPG sites and give us an estimation of someone's epigenetic age. And this was all started several years ago by Dr. Steve Horvath and others who began to notice that patterns in these CPG methylation data were associated with chronological age. And they created these clocks using CPG level data to predict someone's chronological age. And then the next generation of epigenetic clocks went on to predict multimorbidity and mortality, which obviously would be of strong interest to us when we think about survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer. So for the St. Jude Life data that I'm going to show you today, we used something called Levine's phenotypic age, which is an epigenetic clock that consists of 513 CPG sites. And it was chosen because it is trained to predict multimorbidity. So it can tell us a little bit about biological aging, not just their chronological age. Okay, so once we've calculated someone's epigenetic age, we can regress that on their chronological age to estimate something we call epigenetic age acceleration. And this can simply be thought of as the difference between someone's epigenetic age and their chronological age. So if the epigenetic age acceleration, or EAA, is positive, their epigenetic age is older than we would expect for their chronological age. But if it's negative, it's younger than what we would expect. And importantly, there are many things that influence DNA methylation and could influence your epigenetic age. So positive health behaviors could decrease it, but things like stress and negative environmental exposures might increase it. And importantly, emerging evidence is showing us that cancer treatments alter the DNA methylation profile in potentially epigenetic age. So my colleague, Dr. Xiaoming Wang, has led this effort in the St. Jude Life cohort, and they've demonstrated that regardless of diagnosis, survivors have an elevated epigenetic age acceleration compared to controls who have no history of cancer. And interestingly, this was true regardless of chronological age. And you'll also notice that the slopes of these two lines, survivors in yellow and controls in blue, are different. So even though these are cross-sectional data, it does hint at the idea that survivors may be experiencing an accelerated aging phenotype, where their epigenetic age is accruing faster than their peers. So this figure is showing you the mean epigenetic age acceleration by diagnosis, and you can see that regardless of diagnosis, it is higher on average than the controls in blue. And one group in particular sticks out on this graph, and that is our Hodgkin lymphoma survivors on the far right. And I think that intuitively makes sense to a lot of us because these survivors are known to have a particularly high amount of multimorbidity. And if we look by treatment, this figure is showing you the mean epigenetic age acceleration in those who did receive a certain treatment in yellow versus those who didn't in blue. You can see why Hodgkin lymphoma might be differentially affected because those who get chest radiation, abdominal radiation, and alkylators, and even glucocorticoids are associated with having a much higher epigenetic age acceleration. But lastly, and most importantly from this paper, while a higher epigenetic age acceleration was associated with many chronic health conditions, favorable health behaviors like not smoking and being physically active were associated with lower epigenetic age acceleration. So these data are telling us that yes, this is going on, but we can improve someone's biologic aging profile with behavioral interventions or perhaps even proper management and early prevention of chronic health conditions. And emerging research is definitely suggesting that some pharmacologic interventions may also improve epigenetic age acceleration. Next, moving on to physiologic measures of aging, we're going to start with something called Fried's frailty phenotype. And this frailty phenotype was designed to characterize a state of high vulnerability for adverse health outcomes, so a high risk for aging-related conditions. So this index strongly predicts disability, falls, hospitalization, and mortality in the older general population. And it consists of 5 components, including weakness, which is usually measured using grip strength, unintentional weight loss, most often at least 4.5 kilograms in 12 months, extremely low physical activity, slow walking speed, and fatigue. And if a person meets 3 or more of these criteria, they're considered frail. If they have at least 2, they're considered pre-frail. And if they have less than 2, they're considered not frail or robust. And I mentioned that this tool was originally developed in the older adult population, but Dr. Curie Ness at St. Jude has really led the adaptation of this framework and methodology to young adult survivors of pediatric cancer. And when she initially employed this methodology in St. Jude Life back in 2013, there were only 1,900 survivors who were on average about 34 years old and 341 controls with no history of cancer. And she found that 8% of survivors met the criteria for frailty compared to 0%, frailty compared to 0% controls. And she also found that 22% met the criteria for being pre-frail compared to only 6% of controls. And remember, these are young adults with an average age of 34. Moreover, they were able to show that frailty was associated with an increased risk of mortality. And lastly, when she compared the prevalence of frailty among survivors to the prevalence of frailty in something called the Cardiovascular Health Study, and that's a large cohort that recruits adults aged 65 or older, you can see that survivors actually have a similar but higher prevalence of frailty and a much higher prevalence of pre-frailty. So remember, the survivors in blue are on average only 34 years old, but to be eligible for the cardiovascular health study, you had to be at least 65. So these data suggest that survivors of childhood cancer are experiencing a premature aging phenotype. But these data can't really tell us if it's accelerated because we don't have longitudinal data on the controls. What we do have in St. Jude Life is longitudinal data on the survivors. So Dr. Ness took all of the survivors who were not yet frail or pre-frail and followed them forward for 5 years. And she found that almost 10% of survivors experienced new onset frailty and 15% experienced new onset pre-frailty. And I feel like I need to remind you again that these are young adults on average in this group now 30 years old. So in this paper, they also saw that chest radiation and cranial radiation, alkylators and neurologic conditions, and importantly, a sedentary lifestyle were associated with new onset frailty. So again, while these data are quite stark, there is hope because if a sedentary lifestyle is a significant predictor, perhaps we can design interventions to prevent this from happening. Another way we can measure physiologic aging is something called the Deficit Accumulation Index, or DAI. And DAIs originated from the desire to characterize biologic aging, the idea being that changes at the molecular level, cellular level, would ultimately manifest in pathological changes that we could count. So a DAI used readily available clinical and easily obtained self-report data. And this approach was really pioneered by Dr. Samuel Searle and Kenneth Rockwood, who have published several papers to kind of standardize these methodologies. And they suggest that a DAI should consist of 30 to 40 aging-related items. These items are meant to be diverse, ranging from functional limitations to chronic health conditions to psychosocial impairments. And while the items are diverse on their own, they're not necessarily specific, meaning they don't necessarily predict life expectancy, but rather correlate with age. So the example I always like to give with this is hearing loss, definitely correlated with age, but may not predict someone's life expectancy. Interestingly, and this is important for the slides later, A DAI doesn't have to have the same exact items to demonstrate predictive power across studies. So it's not like it's a set questionnaire. You can design your DAI to fit your data as long as it meets these requirements. And these tools have been associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's and related dementias, hospitalizations, and mortality, again, in the older general population with no history of cancer. And until our work, it really hadn't been used to measure aging among survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer. So I led this work to construct a DAI in the St. Jude Life, and we chose 44 aging-related items. And you can see examples of these items on your right. We included functional items such as the ability to shower and dress, as well as chronic health conditions like heart disease, and also included items related to aging like hearing loss. So each item is assigned a weight that ranges from 0, meaning the person does not have it, to 1, meaning it's present and or most severe. So to calculate the DAI, we sum the item weights and divide by the total number of items available. Therefore, the DAI is actually a ratio and ranges from 0 to 1, where a higher score is worse. Now, previous research has also identified clinically meaningful differences of as high as 0.06. And it's also delineated these categories that are really robust at predicting those adverse health outcomes like hospitalization and dementia. So a low DAI is considered below 2, which you can think of as robust. A medium is 0.2 to 0.35, which we tend to think of as pretty frail. And then high is above 0.35, and you can think of that as frail. Okay, so in St. Jude Life, we had 4,000 survivors, and at this point in time, we had over 600 controls with no history of cancer. Again, I want to point out this is a relatively young population who's on average 29 years old, but is 2 decades from their childhood cancer experience. And what we were able to see was that the DAI was significantly and clinically meaningfully higher in the survivors compared with the controls. And this was true regardless of attained chronological age. So this figure is showing you the mean DAI by age with survivors in red and controls in gray. So regardless of age, the survivors have a higher deficit accumulation index. And importantly, if we take the mean age of the survivors, which is 30, their DAI was 0.16. And if you follow that hashed line over, controls don't reach a mean DAI of 0.16 until they're 63 years old. So what these data suggest to us is that there's up to 33 years of premature aging. And again, these are cross-sectional data, so we can only comment on the premature aspect of this, but I'm going to show you some work in the CCSS cohort a couple slides from now that'll comment on the accelerated potential of this. Now, this was true regardless of diagnosis. This figure is showing you again the mean DAI by tumor type in red compared to the controls in black. And we also looked at this by treatment with the mean DAI among those that received a treatment in red versus those who didn't in gray. And you can see that cranial radiation, abdominal radiation, alkylators, platinum agents, and neurosurgery are all associated with a higher DAI. And for those of you that have been keeping track, I'm sure you're noticing that some of the same treatments keep coming up again and again, regardless of how we're measuring aging. The last thing we were able to demonstrate was that the DAI was associated with an increased risk of mortality. So this, this showed us that not only is it associated, it's associated in a dose response fashion. So you can see that the risk increases with increasing DAI category, with those in the high category of the DAI having the highest risk of mortality. But all of those data are cross-sectional, and they definitely would suggest that survivors are experiencing a premature aging phenotype. But to truly know if that phenotype is accelerated, meaning they're declining faster than their peers, we need longitudinal data in both the survivors and the controls, and we simply don't have that in St. Jude Life. But we do have that in something called the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study, or CCSS. So this cohort was funded in the 1990s, and it is a retrospective cohort that includes survivors and their siblings that were diagnosed between 1970 and 1999 from 31 different contributing centers from the US and Canada. Again, they had to be 5-year survivors, but importantly, they've for a couple decades now have been giving us self-reported data in all of these follow-ups. So we were able to design a DAI in the childhood cancer survivor study using 30 aging-related items that included chronic health conditions, activities of daily living, and psychosocial and physical function. And over 21,000 survivors had a DAI available and over 4,600 siblings. And they reported the DAI at up to 5 time points. And importantly, in the CCSS, the time between follow-ups is quite varied for participants. As you can imagine, when you do a study this large, you might receive some surveys closer than others. So we did have to use age as our time scale here, and I want you to keep that in mind as you look at the next figure. But these are longitudinal data. So this figure is showing you the mean DAI plotted by age, but again, you can think of this as time, and survivors in red, and siblings in black. And you'll note that regardless of time or age, survivors still have a much higher deficit accumulation index than their siblings. And for this, we were able to include an age by group interaction, which was statistically significant. And what this is telling us is that the survivors are accumulating deficits faster than the siblings, meaning that yes, the survivors are experiencing an accelerated aging phenotype. And as another way to illustrate this, we know that a small minimal clinically important difference on the DAI is considered 0.2, and survivors are already experiencing that compared to siblings around age 20. And that minimal clinically important difference increases to a large one, which is 0.06 at age 40. And that gap just continues to widen as we increase in time. So again, demonstrating that they are experiencing accelerated aging. And the last thing I'd like to highlight on this slide, because I really think this is truly important and truly illustrates how ahead of their time, these survivors are, is that around age 30, on average, the survivors are already meeting that threshold for pre-frailty, where the sibling controls don't reach that till their mid-50s. And, by age 65, let's say, survivors are on average measuring as frail, and the siblings never even reach that threshold. So again, demonstrating this premature aging phenomenon that we also now know is accelerated. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about cognitive aging among survivors of childhood cancer. And you might be generally familiar with the Children's Oncology Group long-term follow-up guidelines and just the general consensus in the literature that the primary risk factors for neurocognitive impairment in survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer are therapies we think of as being directed to the central nervous system, like cranial radiation, neurosurgery, and intrathecal chemotherapy. And this also would include high metabolite therapies as well, like IV methotrexate. Now, when I look at all the survivors in St. Jude Life, who are again several decades from therapy, about 49% of them who received these therapies test impaired on 3 or more neurocognitive assessments, suggesting that they experience a type of global cognitive impairment. But when I look at the remaining survivors in St. Jude Life who never got any of these therapies, up to 40% of them still meet these criteria. So this suggests 2 possibilities to me. One, that there are indirect pathways to cancer-related cognitive impairment that result in neuronal damage despite no direct therapy to the CNS. And that is a whole other talk I could give another time. But the second is that these long-term survivors are also experiencing accelerated cognitive aging. And whether that's because of those indirect pathways like inflammation, or because demand is just starting to simply exceed reserve. And I think we truly need longitudinal cognitive data in this group to know that. And it's just now becoming available. And I have one paper to share with you by my colleague, Dr. Nicholas Phillips, who I collaborated with this on. And this is data from the childhood cancer survivor study that we just talked about. And what they did was they looked at the 4 most common diagnoses. So central nervous system tumors, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and Hodgkin lymphoma, and then compared them to the siblings. And what they did was they started with anyone who at their first assessment was not impaired on their self-reported neurocognitive functioning. And they followed them forward for about 10 years. So remember, the data that you're looking at exclude those who would have been impaired at baseline. So we're only looking at new onset impairment. And the figure is showing you the risk of new onset impairment relative to the siblings, which are that circle on the line. So CNS tumors are the blue triangle. The orange circle is ALL survivors with cranial radiation exposure, and the bluish gray circle is ALL without cranial radiation exposure. And lastly, the gray square is Hodgkin lymphoma. So you can see that each diagnosis group is at a significantly increased risk of new onset impairment and task efficiency compared to their siblings. And you can think of task efficiency as like an executive function measure. It's our ability to switch between tasks easily. We also see that they have a higher risk of new onset impairment in emotional regulation, organization, and memory. So now in each cognitive domain, the CNS tumor survivors have the highest risk, usually followed by ALL survivors who were treated with cranial radiation, demonstrating the impact of those CNS-directed therapies I talked about. However, other than for organization, Hodgkin lymphoma survivors also have a higher estimate than the ALL without cranial radiation, suggesting that those indirect pathways are definitely at play and may likely involve some mechanisms of premature or accelerated biologic or physiologic aging. Okay, so that is a very quick overview of some measures of biologic, physiologic, and cognitive aging. And I think we have plenty of data to suggest to us that these aging pathways are linked, especially in survivors of childhood and adolescent cancers. And it's easy to imagine how molecular aging related changes, like epigenetic age, might then feed into physiologic changes like frailty or chronic health conditions, and then how those might impart excessive demand on the central nervous system, resulting in cognitive aging. But in reality, these mechanisms are likely happening in concert with one another, feeding each other and compounding on one another. So, for example, additional cognitive impairments may result in further physiologic degradation because of the limitations on an ability to be active, which I mentioned several times today was so protective. So, a large portion of my work actually examines the intersection of these aging domains, and I want to share a little bit of that with you now. Earlier, we talked about epigenetic age as a marker of biologic aging and the deficit accumulation index as a physiologic marker of aging. And I was interested to see how these things were correlated because the DAI was actually, in fact, developed to be a surrogate for biologic aging. So if we could demonstrate the DAI was associated with biologic aging, that would free up a lot of resources in terms of measurement if we could avoid epigenetic assays. And we were able to demonstrate just that. So as you can see in this figure, the mean epigenetic age acceleration is demonstrating a nice dose response relationship with DAI category, with those in the highest DAI category experiencing on average 2 years of epigenetic age acceleration, or they're on average 2 years older than we might expect. Whereas people with a low DAI are actually younger than we might expect. So again, I think this is really important because this suggests to us that there's items on the DAI which may be ready for intervention to improve a wide variety of aging-related outcomes. Next, I have an intentionally busy slide to you, and I want to talk about the overlap between physiologic and cognitive aging. So we examined all the domains, all 18 neurocognitive outcomes on over 4,000 survivors in St. Jude Life. So this includes tests of attention, processing speed, executive function, and memory. And we looked at the risk of impairment in each of those test outcomes associated with being in either the medium or the high DAI group relative to the low DAI group. And for every single test in every domain, a higher deficit accumulation index was associated with an increased risk of impairment. And I've done a lot of cognitive research, and this is the first time I've ever seen an exposure be consistently associated with every single test in every single cognitive domain. So again, this provides us very strong evidence that physiologic aging and cognitive aging are linked in long-term survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer. And I had a couple slides on Freed's frailty and cognitive aging, but I'm going to skip over those so we have more time for questions. And the last thing I'm going to show you is the overlap between biologic and cognitive aging. So going back to our epigenetic age acceleration, we looked at how that was associated with cognitive function in about 1,500 survivors in St. Jude Life. And a priori, we decided to exclude our central nervous system tumor survivors because we felt that the direct impact of the CNS there might outweigh any impact of the biologic effect. And then we also stratified by the remaining CNS-directed therapies. So first, let's look at survivors who did not receive any therapy to the central nervous system. In this figure showing you the mean difference in neurocognitive Z-score among those in the third tertile of epigenetic age acceleration compared to those in the first. So what this graph is showing you is that a higher epigenetic age acceleration is associated with worse performance on tests of verbal reasoning, attention variability, visual-motor processing speed, perseverations, and cognitive switching. In other words, impaired attention, processing speed, and executive functions. And when we look at the survivors who were treated with CNS-directed therapy, a slightly different pattern emerges. We still see that verbal reasoning and attention variability, but rather than processing speed and executive functions, the epigenetic age acceleration appears to be associated with impairments in memory, specifically new verbal encoding and long-term recall. And we're still not sure exactly why this is happening, but we're working on it. But again, strong evidence that these different aging pathways overlap. And if we could intervene on one, we probably will intervene on all. So in summary, our survivors of childhood and adolescent cancer are experiencing premature, if not accelerated, biologic, physiologic, and cognitive aging. And that's predisposing them for premature mortality and chronic health conditions. And as I've said multiple times now, these aging pathways do seem to be linked and perhaps even exacerbating one another. But we do have a lot of questions that we still need to answer. So the major limitation of most of the data I've shown you today is it's largely cross-sectional in nature, with the exception of our DAI work in the CCSS. So we can't truly understand if these patterns are truly accelerated until we have robust longitudinal data from both survivors and controls, which is just now becoming available. We also don't know when this is all starting. So all of the data I showed you today is from very long-term survivors who were on average decades from their diagnosis and treatment. We have very little data from pre to post treatment to help us understand what the entire aging trajectory looks like and when exactly it's starting. And the tricky thing with children and adolescents is that they're still developing that molecular and physiologic and cognitive reserve when we're treating them. So how do we shift our aging framework of thinking and start to measure how much we truncated the development of that reserve rather than the premature or accelerated aging paths I talked about today? And then lastly, because these pathways all seem to be linked to one another, I think now is the time to come up with multimodal interventions that target more than one of them at once. And I've talked several times today about how physical activity was a positive factor in limiting some of these aging pathways. So I think interventions like that obviously have promise, but I would like to see us get a little bit more creative and try to tackle multiple of these pathways at once. I think this is the most hopeful part about this work, and there's so much that could be done here. Lastly, I want to leave you with what I think the clinical impact is. So if survivors are in fact biologically, physiologically, and cognitively older than their chronological age implies, we need to start advocating for them. We need to help them and their providers understand that they need screening and management for aging-related conditions earlier than their peers and much earlier than their primary care providers are likely used to. So, as a cancer survivor myself, I have experienced this bias and I had to push through it to get myself diagnosed with an aging related late effect. And I know that some of you out there have probably had to do the same thing. And I had to go through 3 different providers before someone finally believed me that this was happening to me, all because I didn't fit the stereotype of who it normally happens to. So I think we have a lot of work to do to change the narrative out there and help people understand that yes, the person in front of you, even though they're 22, really is dealing with this and they really need help. They're not making it up. So that's my soapbox as a survivor. But I think, I think the other thing, not just beyond physical conditions, is that we are going to need to start monitoring our survivors for cognitive changes as well. We don't have good data to support this yet, but I do suspect that we may start struggling with that again earlier than our peers. So I just want to leave you with that notion of, I know I'm talking to the believers, but I think the more that we can communicate these data and this message to help the world understand that we really are ahead of our time and we really do need to be treated just a little bit differently. So with that, I will thank all of my collaborators, my lab members. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm going to pass it back to the Access team briefly to just go through some of the next steps.
Um, so I just wanted to thank you, Annalyn, for the presentation. Before we get into Q&A, I just wanted to let the people on the webinar know that we recognize that there could be an appropriate place for a debriefing for survivors and patients and caregivers that may be participating in this webinar. If you haven't had the opportunity and you would like to join us, please scan the QR code on the screen to register. The debriefing session will be a separate meeting that is held immediately following this one, the webinar. The link to register will also be shared in the chat for everyone. So if you miss scanning the QR code while I'm speaking, then please feel free to click on the link in the chat that will be shared. This will be an open session where people can share their thoughts and feelings in a safe space. It will not be recorded, but it will also be able to help people talk to others who may be navigating or have navigated through similar experiences. So if this is helpful to you, please consider joining us. Next slide, please.
Mhm.
So in addition to the debriefing session, there has been as a list of initial community resources that has been curated by different members of the ACCESS community. It can be accessed through the QR link on the screen here, which is a different one than the QR link on the previous screen. And this is just some starting places or some tools and resources people can look to. If other people have other resources that can be added to the list, please let us know. We're very happy to increase the list, but we want everyone to be able to know where they can look for at least some places that they can reach out to if they're helpful. This is also accessible through the ACCESS website, but please feel free to scan the QR code on the screen or reach out to the Secretariat team if you would like access and you can't get access to the QR code. Next screen, please. And as we close out, we're going to take the last 10 minutes for question and answers, which Helen will help us steward through. But we like to hear from everyone about how they feel the webinars have gone and any feedback. We invite you to share your insights with this third QR code, which is different than the other two. And this will also be shared in the chat. So without further ado, maybe Annalyn, if you maybe want to stop sharing altogether, Helen will be able to help walk us through. Oh, sorry. The Access Presents has a place on our website. And this is where you can get access to different of the Access Presents presentations, share your ideas, and get access to the recordings of the different webinars. I did see that there was a question about sharing slides. A version of this recording of this webinar will be accessible on the website, and through that, you will be able to see the slides and see the presentation again. So now, please, Annalyn, if you could stop sharing, and Helen, if you could help us walk through the Q&A.
Sure, thanks. And if everybody will forgive me, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just to try and get through. We have many questions. Thanks for that really insightful talk, Annalyn, and a lot of
Pleasure.
great questions. So I will paraphrase a little bit. So if everybody will allow me that. The first is the risk, and this actually ties into one of your last slides, actually, about the risk benefit analysis of certain sports on survivors. So is there any data or studies on the best types of sports and exercise for survivors?
So not that I've seen, and I actually this is what I was alluding to when I said, can we get more creative? Because I think there's many, many ways to be physically and cognitively active, and people enjoy a wide variety of things. So I think we do need research like this that's tailored to what people are interested in doing. And I actually have a postdoctoral fellow joining my lab this fall who's really interested in this. So maybe I'll be able to come back or have her come back someday and give a talk about that. I would love for that to happen. But it's such a great point, and I think we need to meet people where they're at and foster their interests and what's going to keep them active.
Great, thanks. And that's great to know that there's some studies that will get started in that area.
I'm going to support her
Um,
as much as I can.
that's fantastic. Is there any data or findings around the use of certain supplements that may help reduce rapid onset of aging in survivors?
This is definitely an area that is growing rapidly. There's been some studies on vitamin D that haven't been that conclusive, unfortunately. But there's other more like what's the word, neuropathic, or no, that's not the word, naturopathic studies going on. I actually have a colleague here, Luke Papone, who's doing some of this work and looking at CBD and things like that. To see if they can impart aging. So I guess my general answer to this question is that the science is early, but growing rapidly. And I think this is of interest to many, many different people, right? Like, how can we supplement our diet and just feel better? So the answer is no, but it's coming.
Okay, great. So DAI, deficit accumulation index,
Mhm.
feels like, sorry, staging of cancer to some degree. How do we socialize this and communicate it to survivors and their families in less scary ways?
Yeah, I do agree with you there. The DAI, that is probably the next grant that we're writing, is how exactly to do that, like how exactly to implement it in a clinically sensitive way that resonates with people with messages of hope and opportunity versus like a sentence, right? So I do think the DAI is really unique because it takes into account not just chronic health conditions, your physical multimorbidity, but also your psychosocial health and your function and your ability to do daily activities. So it really is this multidimensional tool that is meant to capture as much of your life and what's going on as possible. So the nice thing about that tool, if we were able to implement it clinically, is we can go through it and we can talk through, like, okay, well, which one of these things do you think, might be someplace where we can talk about different ways to manage it or different ways to improve it, or something that we can prevent. So there's a lot of work yet to be done to make that a tool that's used for care communication and is used to guide care. But we're definitely committed to making that happen.
Great, thank you. And then I guess a question about the sibling studies. So the question is, paraphrasing again, were these identical twins or siblings? And because there's obviously a difference in
Mhm.
the
Yeah. They are
the
not, there might be some twins in there, but they are in fact just only siblings. So being a twin is not a requirement for participating in the CCSS, just being a sibling is. And obviously the number of siblings is smaller, so not everyone in the CCSS did have a sibling participate. But the idea is by recruiting siblings, hopefully we controlled for some of the early life environment differences that may be now impacting their adulthood, but obviously not as we can't control for the full genetic predisposition like twins would.
Great, thanks. In terms of predisposition to Alzheimer's, is it possible that um, you know Okay, let me get this question right. So for families that have a history of Alzheimer's, there's the worry of early onset for children that are
Mhm.
cancer survivors and also have this predisposition. So I guess can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, this has been something that's been difficult to study. I think, the bulk majority of research in the general population actually points to an inverse association between cancer and Alzheimer's. There's something about that we don't understand yet about those who like something genetic, presumably, about those who get cancer that seems protective against Alzheimer's, if that offers some glimmer of hope. So I don't know that childhood cancer survivors are truly at risk for Alzheimer's, but I do think they are at risk for different cognitive impairments that might not quite reach that threshold, but they may start to notice do cause some difficulties in their everyday life. I would say that I and others are again working really hard to bring awareness to this venue, particularly for patients who've never been treated with those CNS directed therapies. So unfortunately, this is one of those situations where we have to be our own advocates and we have to be the squeaky wheel. And I think my best advice is if you think you're struggling with this, tell as many providers as you can about it and try to get in to see a neuropsychological provider. A lot of larger academic medical centers now have like memory clinics. You can go in, you can get a baseline done. They can recommend different things to do. If you're not experiencing, these impairments, but you're worried about it, I would say the biggest thing you can do is stay physically and cognitively active. And, I think, like I said earlier, there's many, many different ways to do that. I'm not saying you need to go out and run a marathon, but like if you like to crochet, crochet. If you like to woodwork, woodwork. If you love baking, do that. If you have a book club, do that. I think it's about keeping our minds active and keeping our bodies active. That's the best thing we can do for many different outcomes, but especially cognition.
Great, thank you. There's also a comment as well about wanting to see another session on survivors with no CNS and cognitive impacts.
Oh yeah, I have lots of data.
Great. Okay, so a couple of comments that the work presented explains what is seen in follow-up of survivors. So this is a technical question. Could the agents we give that we do not think cross the blood-brain barrier indeed cause this cognitive change? And
Yeah.
the same for targeted therapies we are giving in immunotherapies.
So first so the targeted therapies and immunotherapies is a little bit more complicated of an answer, but let me just tell you broadly what we think is happening. We think that the tumor itself, especially in our hematologic malignancy patients, but also in our solid tumor patients, the tumor itself and its microenvironment creates this pro-inflammatory environment. So, you know, that pro-inflammatory environment can actually weaken your blood-brain barrier. So we have these tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier, and if there's a lot of inflammation in the bloodstream, those tight junctions can loosen a little bit. And that would allow some agents we don't traditionally think of as crossing the blood-brain barrier to cross. So that's one hypothesized way that we think these therapies that we don't generally consider targeting the CNS may actually cross into the CNS and cause some damage. The other way is just that the inflammation itself gets through, and that can actually it can activate microglial cells and increase neuronal damage. I don't want to get too technical, but that's kind of the main way we think this is happening. Now, the problem being that targeted therapies, immunotherapies, this is all very new, but we do know that they elicit some immune mediated adverse events and some of them even increase the production of cytokines, which are an inflammatory molecule. So we assume that those agents may still impart some of this risk, but again, we're just now collecting that data as those treatments become more common. So we'll be able to comment on that soon.
Great, thanks. I'm cognizant of the time here, Stephanie. I do have a few more questions. Can I keep going?
We'll take one more question, and any other questions that weren't able to be answered, we'll make sure we ask Anna Lynn, and we'll make sure we provide them to the community afterwards.
Okay, that's great. So I will just actually ask maybe a question that a lot of people have on their minds. What testing or screening do you recommend for age-related conditions?
So I don't know how widely this is talked about in Canada, but in the US, we have the Children's Oncology Group, which does include some of our Canadian colleagues, and they've developed something called the long-term follow-up guidelines, and an application called Passport for Care to help people follow those guidelines. So it is a tremendous amount of work to go through those guidelines yourself and see what the care should be. But I can't make a blanket recommendation because the follow-up care truly depends on how you were treated and what you were treated with. It's risk stratified depending on what types of treatments you got. So I would suggest if you can, if you're in an area that does have a survivorship clinic or even a high risk hereditary clinic, you could reach out to those clinics and try to get in with them and have them help you organize that care. If you're in a more remote area where you don't have access to that, you can, print out those guidelines and kind of highlight the treatments that you got and talk with your general practitioner about what your approach to screening should be. Again, this is another area we're working on is how to streamline this and make it as effective as possible.
That's great, thank you. And just as a side comment, we Access is supporting piloting of Passport for Care across Canada. So we're pleased to hear that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, see, that's the answer. Perfect.
That's great. Okay, so I apologize to the questions that I didn't get to, but as Stephanie said, we'll work with Annalyn to try and help get your answers. And I also wanted to say, Annalyn, that there were several thanks for a great talk comments in the Q&A. So I will end my part of this with that and send it back to Stephanie.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was truly my honor, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who has more questions.
With that, thank you, Annalyn. Thank you, everyone who has joined the webinar today.